There was a time when nearly every garden contained a plant that people today often pass by without even noticing. It wasn't something exotic or rare. It didn't carry a high price. And yet, for generations, it was regarded as one of the most powerful plants a household could cultivate. Long before laboratories existed, before pharmaceutical industries developed, and before synthetic treatments became common, people depended on what grew close to their homes. Among those everyday plants, tansy held a reputation that now seems almost hard to believe. Not because it was gentle or mild, but because it was potent, and at times, dangerously so. Tansy was never just an accidental weed. It was planted intentionally. You could see it growing behind small homes, along fences, near animal enclosures, and in monastery gardens throughout Europe. Yeah, farmers were familiar with it. Healers treated it with respect. And families clearly understood one important fact. This was not a plant to use carelessly. Its bright yellow button-like flowers appeared cheerful and harmless at first glance. But its scent revealed a very different nature. It was sharp, bitter, and medicinal. A smell that insects instinctively avoided and animals learned to stay away from. That alone says a great deal. In traditional herbal practices, tansy was never used like a daily tea or a soothing herb. It was applied sparingly with clear intention and according to knowledge passed down through generations. People didn't experiment with it. They followed established rules. Historically, tansy was closely associated with cleansing. Not in the modern wellness sense, but in a practical, survival-focused way. It was used during times when parasites, pests, and infestations were a normal part of life. Humans dealt with them. Animals dealt with them. Even homes were affected by them. And tansy played a role in that defense. Bundles of tansy were hung inside houses to keep insects away. Fresh leaves were rubbed along doorways, windows, and bedding. Dried plants were placed among stored grains and clothing. This wasn't based on guesswork. It was based on repeated observation that it worked. In livestock practices, tansy had a reputation that inspired caution, even fear. Farmers understood that it had a strong effect on internal systems. With that understanding came strict limitations. Too little had no effect. Too much could be harmful. As a result, its use was controlled, seasonal, and carefully measured. What truly set tansy apart from many other plants was its chemistry. Even without modern knowledge of compounds or molecular structure, people recognized its strength. This was not a plant meant for daily use. It was something used briefly and then stopped. That pattern alone distinguishes it from gentler herbs. Over time, as industrial agriculture and modern medicine expanded, tansy gradually faded from everyday discussion. Not because it stopped being effective, but because it didn't align with a system that prefers standardized dosages and predictable results. Tansy doesn't behave the same way in every situation. Its strength can vary depending on soil, climate, and stage of growth. That variability made it unsuitable for large-scale, standardized use, but perfectly suited to traditional, experience-based knowledge. Modern perspectives often try to compare traditional plants directly with modern treatments. That's where misunderstandings begin. Traditional remedies were never intended to replace modern medicine in a direct, one-to-one way. They existed within an entirely different framework of thinking. People didn't ask, "Is this stronger than that?" They asked, "Does this solve the problem we're facing right now?" And for centuries, tansy answered that question in specific, limited, and respected ways. One reason tansy is rarely discussed today is safety. Traditional healers consistently emphasized caution. This was not a plant for children, not for pregnant women, not for long-term use. Understanding its limitations was just as important as understanding its benefits. As that cultural knowledge faded, the plant itself began to be labeled simply as dangerous instead of powerful. And once a plant gains that kind of reputation, it often becomes easier to ignore than to properly explain. But forgetting it doesn't erase its history. In many historical texts, tansy appears alongside other plants that are still considered essential in herbal traditions today. It wasn't obscure knowledge. It was widely known, just handled with care. Another reason for its disappearance is that modern life has removed many of the problems it was once used to address. Controlled environments, processed food systems, improved sanitation, and veterinary care have reduced the everyday threats people once faced. And when the problem disappears, the tool often fades with it. Yet the plant itself never vanished. Tansy still grows easily. Now, it thrives even in poor soil. It resists pests. It survives both cold winters and hot summers. It spreads quietly, almost as if it still remembers its original purpose. Today, gardeners who grow tansy often do so for reasons unrelated to medicine, such as companion planting, natural insect control, or maintaining historical gardens. And even then, they tend to notice something interesting. Insects avoid it. Animals avoid it. Nearby plants often experience less pest damage. These observations reflect what people already understood in the past. What made tansy valuable was never mystery or superstition. It was consistency. Generation after generation observed the same effects and respected the same limitations. And that's the part that is often forgotten. Traditional remedies were never casual. They required discipline. Tansy represents a type of knowledge that modern society often struggles to accept. The idea that something can be both useful and dangerous at the same time. That kind of power requires responsibility, not exaggeration or hype. So when people ask, why doesn't anyone talk about tansy anymore? The answer is actually quite simple. It demands respect and requires context, and it cannot be simplified. In a world that favors quick answers and safe, simplified messages, tansy doesn't fit. But for those who study traditional gardens, historical medicine, and older survival practices, tansy still remains quietly present in the background. Not forgotten, but waiting for those who understand that power without wisdom is never true progress. And sometimes, the plants we stop talking about are the very ones that remind us how cautious our ancestors needed to be, and how much knowledge they truly possessed. 2. Wormwood. If tansy could be compared to a sharp blade, quick, decisive, and unforgiving, then wormwood was more like a steady knife that remained in hand over time. Wormwood didn't overwhelm the system all at once. Instead, it worked gradually through repetition, consistency, and rhythm. This difference shaped how various cultures understood and used it. While tansy required strict precision and careful restraint, wormwood encouraged familiarity and ongoing use. Its bitterness became almost legendary. For centuries, people used wormwood as the very definition of bitterness. Rather than simply calling something bitter, they would describe it as like wormwood. That comparison continued to exist even after the plant itself faded from common daily use. Unlike tansy, wormwood was rarely used on its own. It was typically blended, combined, and carefully adjusted. Small quantities, regular use, long-standing traditions built around measured application. This flexibility made it highly adaptable, and that adaptability allowed wormwood to spread across different regions, climates, and cultural systems. In monasteries, it was cultivated with discipline and intention. In rural areas, it often grew wild, but was still harvested thoughtfully. Along trade routes, it appeared in many forms: dried, powdered, infused. It became part of structured practices rather than standing as a single, isolated remedy. Where tansy had a brief but intense presence, wormwood remained present over time. That consistency became especially important as formal medicine began to develop. Plants that could be diluted, repeated, and carefully recorded were more likely to persist within emerging medical systems. In contrast, plants that required intuition and strict restraint often faded away. Traditional healers seemed to understand this naturally. Wormwood was seen as more forgiving. If mistakes were made, they could be corrected. Quantities could be adjusted. Time allowed for learning and refinement. Tansy offered no such margin for error. For this reason, wormwood was often considered the first step in a process. Not because it was weaker, but because it allowed space for adjustment. And within traditional knowledge, that flexibility was a form of safety. Wormwood was not meant to conclude a process, but to begin it. 3. Black walnut. Black walnut entered traditional use through a different path. It wasn't ancient legend that brought attention to it. It was direct observation. People noticed what happened when they handled black walnut hulls. Skin would darken, fabric would stain, tools would be marked. The plant left visible traces behind. Nothing about it was subtle or hidden. Those stains took on symbolic meaning. If a plant could leave such a lasting mark on wood and cloth, people believed it must also have a deep-reaching effect in other ways. Compared to the sudden intensity of tansy, black walnut felt slower and more deliberate. Its influence developed gradually over time. Where tansy acted like a sudden flash of lightning, black walnut resembled water, steady, persistent, and quietly shaping everything in its path. This difference affected how people trusted it. Some traditions valued black walnut specifically because it did not act too quickly. It allowed time for the body to respond and adjust. Others were more cautious precisely because its effects seemed to linger, and anything that lingered carried a sense of uncertainty. Black walnut required commitment. Once used, it was not something easily ignored or reversed. This stands in contrast to wormwood, which could be paused, modified, or stopped without much difficulty. Black walnut, both symbolically and practically, remained present longer. Because of this, it was both respected and approached with caution. The comparison between tansy and black walnut highlights an important idea within traditional thinking, that strength was not judged only by intensity, but also by duration. A sudden storm comes and goes, but slow erosion reshapes the landscape over time. Both hold power, yet only one changes things quietly and for the long term. 4. Garlic may seem simple at first glance, and that simplicity is exactly where its strength lies. While tansy existed on the outer edges of gardens and wormwood occupied a more balanced middle space, garlic lived right at the heart of everyday life. It moved easily between roles: food, flavor, protection, ritual, medicine, even superstition. It fulfilled all of these roles, quietly. Garlic wasn't valued because it was intense or dramatic. It was valued because it was constant. Day after day it appeared in meals. Year after year it was planted again. Generation after generation, its use was passed down naturally without ceremony or caution. There were no strict warnings, no elaborate rituals, no sense of fear surrounding it. Compared to tansy, garlic was mild. Compared to wormwood, it was sustaining. Compared to black walnut, it was forgiving. Its strength came not from force, but from repetition. Traditional cultures understood something that modern thinking often overlooks. Effectiveness doesn't always come from intensity. Sometimes true power lies in consistency. Garlic didn't demand attention. It didn't signal risk. It didn't create boundaries. And that is exactly why garlic became widely accepted, while tansy did not. Tansy required discipline and restraint. Garlic rewarded routine and habit. When people today try to compare traditional plants to modern solutions, they often miss this key difference. Tansy was never intended for everyday use. Wormwood required respect and careful handling. Black walnut asked for commitment. Garlic simply asked to be included. And over time, that steady presence quietly reshaped systems. Both garlic and tansy were effective, but they followed completely different philosophies. One acted quickly and decisively. The other worked gradually and continuously. That contrast explains why one disappeared from daily kitchens, while the other remained. 5. Rue may be the closest philosophical counterpart to tansy, not because it behaves the same way, but because it demands a similar level of respect. Rue was never considered an ordinary plant. From the moment it was planted, it carried meaning. It wasn't grown purely for beauty or abundance. It was grown for presence. Historically, rue was placed at boundaries, near doorways, along borders, beside pathways. Where tansy defined limits through action, rue defined them through awareness. Rue was associated with perception, not simply physical sight, but a deeper sense of noticing. It was believed to sharpen awareness, to help detect imbalance. In some traditions, rue was used before important choices, rituals, or life transitions, not to force change, but to recognize it. Tansy, in contrast, was used when recognition was no longer enough. This difference was essential. In symbolic terms, rue signaled that something was wrong. Tansy acted once that boundary had already been crossed. Because of this, the two plants were rarely used together without clear purpose. Traditional gardeners understood that combining strong influences without thought wasn't strength. It was risk. Power was controlled through separation, not accumulation. Rue had its place. Tansy had its moment. Even the way they grew reflected this idea. Rue develops slowly with a woody, steady structure. It doesn't spread aggressively or rush its growth. It remains where it is planted and invites deliberate interaction. Tansy, on the other hand, spreads freely. It fills space quickly. It doesn't wait or hold back. Placing them side by side without intention symbolized imbalance. Traditional systems were not afraid of powerful plants. They were cautious of careless combinations. That perspective has largely faded today. Modern approaches often evaluate plants individually, removed from their context. But historically, meaning came from relationships, where a plant grew, what surrounded it, and when it was used. Rue and tansy were not opposites. They were guardians positioned at different points along the same boundary,